introduction and invitation. Really glad to be here and to have the opportunity to dialogue with all of you about this question of engaging issues of race, racism, and racial justice in teacher education. My plan for today is I wanted to start off thinking about why we should talk about or address issues of race in teacher education in the first place, and explore the larger political context of addressing race in teacher education. So hopefully that's really about the first third of my talk. And the second and third, talking about my research as one piece in this larger project of advancing teacher education's engagement with race, racism, and racial justice. So why talk about race as teacher educators in 2015? And when we address issues of race and racism, the first and obvious response is thinking about the achievement gap. And while that's important, and while it's really important for us to acknowledge these differential outcomes, I do want us to step back just a bit more and really contend with this idea of schools and programs of teacher education as sites where we learn to construct, consent to, navigate, challenge, and re-envision a racialized society. And understanding the larger context in which we teach and we engage teachers. I think it's also important for us to think about when we're thinking about what sort of teachers we're working with and what sort of work we're doing on our own, and the societies and the larger societal context in which we're consenting and navigating issues of race. Also acknowledge the new and continuing forms of racialized violence that exist. One is thinking about state violence. And undoubtedly, for all of us, the cases of Eric Gardner and Michael Brown, considering police violence and new racialized forms of violence that exist. But also, if we think about our handling as a nation of immigration and the unaccompanied minors last year, if we think about the CIA torture report and thinking about the racialization of Muslims and Arab Americans and South Asians, there are new and continuing forms of racialized violence that we have to acknowledge and we have to contend with. There's forms of systemic violence in terms of thinking about differential outcomes in health, in terms of nutrition. And there's emotional and epistemological violence that was exemplified in the banning of ethnic studies in Arizona. So some of these forms continue, some of these forms of violence are new. But again, it's essential for us to think about schools as these sites of reproduction and transformation, where again, we're learning to consent to or challenge or navigate or hopefully reimagine our racialized society. What we also see is an unprecedented amount of income inequality and wealth inequality that exists today. And again, if we think back from the 1960s today, there's been a disproportionate concentration of income in the top 5%. And if we again disaggregate this to the first top 1%, it's even more drastic. That we are living in a time of unprecedented economic inequality. And again, what does it mean for us to think about this as schools where we learn to, again, either consent to or challenge these forms of inequality? What's also important for us to acknowledge is that that this income inequality or this wealth inequality is racialized. And there, by multiple measures, it's actually, the problem has worsened over the last 4 decades. So again, stepping back and thinking about these, how we come to understand these forms of inequality, but then live with them. When we think about income inequality and racialized violence, there is a tendency for us to think about these as separate entities. But it's, again, really important for us to consider the connection between them. Whether it's drawing on Antonio Gramsci's work or David Harvey's work, what we see is times of increased economic inequality also required particular types of coercion or particular types of violence. Right? So these aren't disconnected phenomena, but they are uniquely connected. Now, there's a challenge of talking about race today especially in teacher education programs. And for one, I think it's important to acknowledge the ways in which teacher education is under attack. It's also important for us to acknowledge the ways in which we've been destabilized in good and bad ways, or in problematic ways. One is the push for deregulation, and again, Ken's work on venture philanthropy, the real college, we see a lot in terms of forms of deregulation. We also see forms of control, whether it's the National Council for Teacher Quality, whether we think about the new forms of the new federal proposals around teacher education, that there are these two forms of attack. And these, though, as disconnected as they might seem, they're very much tied together in terms of thinking about market reform and opening up teacher education to market processes. And then we see critiques both within and without, outside of schools of education, whether it's Arnie Duncan's critiques or Arthur Levine's critiques of teacher education programs being overly theoretical and ultimately ineffectual. And this is a terribly difficult context in which to address issues of race, but it's important for us to acknowledge and contend with. But all of this again happens within the top level context. Again, drawing on work of people like David Harvey, that there's a larger national and global context of neoliberalism and market reform, that these aren't issues that are isolated to teacher education, but there's a societal ideological context in which we have to do our work. So when we think about our roles and responsibilities as teachers and teacher educators, within this context of intensifying inequality, there are multiple ways forward. And part of what we need to do is engage with this question, what are the different consequences of different choices? And what are different questions, strategies, approaches, and visions that we're going to engage with? And most often in conversations with other teacher educators, I think part of what happens is the prevalent progressive response in teacher education, given the larger context in which all of this is happening, is saying that we need to survive. Right? If we don't adapt, we're not going to survive. Teacher education programs of teacher education are going to be obsolete. It's essential that we adapt. There's a question of staying relevant, right? If we don't enter these debates and if we don't participate in them, the phrase that has started to frustrate me more than anything else is that train's left the station, right? If we're going to stay relevant, we need to participate in these conversations. Or ultimately, going back to our good intentions, saying, well, we're trying to do the best we can within the larger context. And all of this is important to acknowledge. All of this is strategic. But again, going back to, I draw a lot on Stuart Hall's work, and thinking about Stuart Hall's work, an interpretation of this is, a lot of this ends up ultimately being limited by the logic of the current debate. There isn't a space for us to ask different questions. There isn't a space for us to, in Stuart Hall's language, to re-articulate the issues. Right? We're trapped by the logic that exists. And for me, a big part of this is going back to a commitment to democracy and thinking about the role of teachers and teacher educators within a democratic context, and recognizing and supporting teachers as conscious social agents in a stratified democracy. And that's, as unpopular as this might be, and as within the current political context, I do believe there's a responsibility for us who are positioned in these institutions and have a space to push on this. I think it's also incredibly important for us to step back and think about this notion of recognizing teachers as social agents in the stratified democracy emerging out of the context of the Great Depression, another space of great inequality, that a lot of this work happened at Teachers College with William Kilpatrick, George Count, Helen Ruggs, John Dewey, really contending with the sense of what does it mean to teach in a society that is so unequal? And there's a tradition for us to return to contend with this. And not that the answers existed then, the social context, the political context is different, but how do we make sense of the same issues here and now? And when we talk about this notion of social agents, I do just want to give at least 3 notions of why I think this is important, and we can complexify this as we move forward. But one is going back to this idea that the work of teachers really exists at the intersection of structure and ideology, policy, student learning experience, and communities. And it's not about preparing future citizens or future workers, right? It's about teachers shaping society. And going back to that notion of social foundations, that the classroom culture that they shape within their work could be and should be a microcosm of society, for better or worse. It's a place where we practice democracy. It's a place where we practice engaging with differences in power. And how, in the ideal, and there are limitations to this romanticized version of it, but how this practicing of democracy in this context then reshapes the larger social context in which we live. The second component of this is allowing teachers as political actors to shape their local context and struggles. And I think oftentimes what happens is we erase the political agency of teachers and prescribe solutions. But our contexts are so different. Whether it's Seattle, LA, New York, Chicago, rural spaces, our contexts are so different. And given all these struggles in which they're working, it's essential for teachers to be able to make sense of their own political contexts and the work that they're doing at their school sites. And again, going back to the work of scholars such as Lois Weiner, thinking about how teachers then start to build solidarity with others, right? Whether it's parents, whether it's students, whether it's other marginalized groups, but where we see our work as teachers connected to a larger political struggle. And the last piece of it is thinking about how teachers as social and political agents shape pedagogy and purpose. And I hesitate to put both of these on the same slide, but we see work such as Level Law, which I find really erases the complexity of teaching, or high leverage practices or core practices, which I think thoughtfully engages how teachers can create effective classrooms. But I think a commonality with a number of these perspectives that I think we really have to engage is that a lot of this is dominated by the language of success for all. And it's that component that I think we need to problematize. Going back to Danny Martin's work, understanding that this notion of success for all can make it really difficult to see processes of race and racism. Right? So then how do we move some of the really important work being done in strands such as core practices or high level practices to complexify the historical, political, and social context in which this is happening in classrooms? I do think it's really important for us to, again, also come back to this question, success for what? And more than anything else, that if we believe in success for all, what does it mean to succeed in a society that is inherently inequitable? Right? What does it mean to succeed in a society that requires stratified labor? Right? And if we don't contend with these questions of what we're preparing students for, and we think about success, but erase the larger political context in which this is happening, there are challenges that exist there. And it's essential, I'd argue, for teachers to be able to look at their own practice, to look at their curriculum, to look at their pedagogy, and to take what's most important, but also to see how processes of power play out in this. So with this larger question of advancing teacher education's engagement with issues of race, racism, racial justice, I'd really like to focus on this dimension of recognizing and supporting teachers as conscious social agents. But I also just want to stress that this has to happen in multiple levels. Obviously, this is work that has to happen at the policy level, the programmatic levels of teacher education programs, and pedagogical levels. Also, just do want to emphasize here that a lot of my work has been around the pedagogical and the programmatic. But part of the, and I'll return to this argument later, but really stressing the fact that if we don't think about, when we think about meritocracy, it's not as if people have Brett Adam Smith or Friedman and just really taken on these ideas, but it's this idea that the harder you work, the more likely you are to succeed. There's something very commonsensical about that. But it was also a recognition that a lot of folks in social theory and cultural studies have made very strong arguments of how these processes work at a societal level. But when it comes to individuals, there's very little that's said about how individuals change. Right? How do we learn ideologies? How do we transform ideologies? On the flip side, we have people in the learning sciences who have paid a lot of attention to how conceptual change occurs, largely in math and science, but have oftentimes shied away from the larger political context. And I think being in this space initially was an opportunity to think about how do we leverage the analytical tools from the learning sciences to start looking at questions around ideology, reiterate the fact that they're oftentimes accepted without question. Naturalized to remind ourselves that they're socially constructed, that they take meaning in a particular historical and social context. So examples of that might be, if you try harder, you will succeed. Some kids are just smart. Inequality will always exist. And we see a lot of ideologies operating like this, right? It's like we can't do anything about it. There are always going to be poor people. Inequality will always exist. Or the sense that if you try hard, that's why people have succeeded, right? It really comes down to that. Stuart Hall would argue, again, part of this notion of ideological struggle at a societal level is changing the contextual meaning of those commonsensical ideas. Right? So you could think about other ways of thinking about these same issues, right? People will do well if they are supported, intelligence is malleable, or greed causes inequality. And we see ourselves actually moving across these different ways of thinking in different contexts, right? We're not monolithic. People don't, I'd argue, like moving away from psychological models, that people don't have beliefs and attitudes that they hold across contexts, but we move across these very commonsensical ways of making sense of the world. So at a societal level, part of it is reshaping what does it mean about that it really creates this context in which students are disengaging from schools, which is starting to take a systemic analysis or institutional analysis of this phrasing, right? But then she continues, they already do that anyways. The parents, if it's not convenient for babysitting, they keep them at home, or picking them up is not convenient, so they keep them at home. So if we focus on this shift here, right, between they, initially that was really trying to engage with this institutional analysis of administrators and teachers, but here there's a shift towards parents. And there are a number of interpretations that we might engage with, and I think the most common interpretation in teacher education, oftentimes drawing on theories of critical whiteness, or even the psychological model that hold one true belief, is a sense that this is her true belief here, right? That this is who she is, and at some point it breaks down and her true feelings come out here. And I think that interpretation is really problematic. But what we're seeing here is not that she holds one or the other, but she holds both, right? And there's a way in which she's moving between one and the other. And what is our responsibility as teacher educators to create context in which she can hone this argument, and the salience of this argument becomes less and less pertinent within those interpretations. But this process of contending with these ideas or making sense of them is far more complex than we oftentimes make them out to be. And so that was an instance. I also want to spend a little bit of time thinking about what this looks like over an extended period of time. So this was taken from a study with a group of 5 first and second year teachers, and they were engaged in teacher inquiry or teacher research around their own practice. And they were looking at how to incorporate issues of social justice in the math and science classroom. And the study that they did focused on one second-year math teacher in particular, and the process was a year-long process in which, again, they're investigating an issue that's relevant about their own teaching, and they would present their findings along the way to a larger group, and they would receive advice and help from their colleagues as they made sense of their practice. So at the very beginning of the year, as we're starting to think about the larger issues that exist, this was very soon after the initiation of the Iraq War, and the teacher, Paul Allen, talked about a lot of issues that he's passionate about, that he would like to explore. So one, he was contending with this idea that school tracking, especially in math, is highly inequitable. He was trying to make sense of the Iraq War and what that means in terms of education, and he wanted to bring in math curriculum that would either think about the cost of war or the disproportionate representation of young people of color on the front lines, and really engage his students through a math curriculum around issues of social justice. And he complexified practice and thought about ways in which do we really assign homework as teachers because it's essential to their learning, or do we assign homework just out of, is it more perfunctory, is it ways of social control? So he's contending with all these different issues. But as he starts to formulate his question that he wants to pursue over the course of the year, his question was, why do students fail at being students? And again, it's really important to think about all the ways in which he's thinking about the world, but what he ends up focusing on. And for one, it's important for us to acknowledge that this is formulated within the real struggles of a second-year teacher who's assigning homework and students aren't coming back with homework, right? There's something deeply personal there. So in terms of however much he thought about these larger issues, this was a really pressing issue for him. But what he had also done before he presented this question was survey the successful and unsuccessful students in his class. And he was curious about how they spent their time after school. His assumption was that the successful students used their time more appropriately, the unsuccessful students didn't. So when we start to think about this question, why this is salient, part of it is an understanding, his way of making sense of it, is that some students are just successful or not successful. There's a binary there. And there's this assumption that students just don't use their time wisely. During that first meeting, part of what happens, one of the teachers asks, so what differences did you find amongst your teachers? And Alan acknowledges there, well, I looked at both piles, there really wasn't a difference. And he acknowledges that, but then he continues to say, so I'm really interested in knowing for those students who are not successful, are they spending their time on leisure activities, or are they helping out at home? And is it working with obligations for parents? And again, I think what's really important to understand here, at this point, that question it's not relevant, right? The data should show, according to him, that it doesn't really matter. Or if it does, then you have to start thinking about, well, maybe they're spending the same amount of time, but they're using their time differently, or it's because people come with different capital. There are other ways of pursuing it. But instead, he focuses on more of a dominant assumption that, well, these are poor kids of color, so some of them it's legitimate for some of them to help their parents, but those who aren't have no excuse, right? So we kind of think about the multiple dominant framings that are coming into play here. So his notion of why students fail at being students are really shaped by these very common sense understandings of success and failure, and these larger issues that he's trying to grapple with really don't come into play here. Soon after this meeting, I sent Alan an email, and I followed up with some of Pauline Littman's work. And I tried to urge Alan, using Pauline's work, thinking about the importance of examining our own practice right, as teachers, and trying to make this argument that we really need to assume the best on the part of students and parents, but focus on classroom and school practices over what we have control. And again, going back to Lippmann's work, there's a tendency for us to focus on things that we see as beyond our control, and it's a way of, in many ways, abdicating our responsibility. So after this, Alan's like, thank you for the reminder. I'll make sure I don't blame students in the process. And he comes back to the next meeting or his next presentation, and he's again trying to make sense of all of this. And in addition to the other ideas he had, it's this strong sense that students don't come prepared because either they're not motivated, they don't plan ahead, or they don't have the right home environment. And again, falling into a lot of these similar ways of making sense of the problem. A shift that we start to see, though, is he does two things. He, one, acknowledges that students have to come to a self-realization that this has to be a part of their process, and it can't be imposed by teachers. Right? It has to be, you have to recognize student agency here, but then also teachers can change their classroom context to support these changes. And that, I'd argue, is a beginning of a conceptual understanding of what it means for teachers to blame students. At this point in the process, there's also a realization for me of how complicated this construct is, right? When we say things like teachers shouldn't blame students, or you shouldn't hold deficit understandings of students, that these are really complex constructions that we assume commonality with, right? So there are multiple ways of thinking about it. One could be like you're just ignoring deficits, right? That at some level, the fault is of these students and parents, but I'm just not going to say it, right? I'm just going to pretend it's not there. And that's one way in which people make sense of it. There are ways, well, it's not their fault, that these deficits, again, emerge out of the inequitable conditions in which people live. And another piece of it, and this is partially where I was operating from, is really thinking about this whole construct actually reproducing forms of inequality, right? Where it's not that we start to see our own agency or our own culpability in reproducing the structure that exists. So the third point I'm going to focus on again is when Alan comes back to the space, again with his question at hand, and after he presented that point, I do pause him right there, and I do interject there. And what I interject at this point is really thinking about the political nature of questions, and trying to reframe his question of why do students fail at being students, and opening up this possibility. Can we think about this differently? Can we think about it as why do schools fail students at being students? And then thinking about the ways in which we might construct alienation in classrooms, right? How does this focus that Alan's playing with, how does that actually create the alienation in the classroom that he's starting to see? And Alan at this point pauses, and he says he doesn't say much at this point. He says, "That's awesome, thank you. I'm going to drop the idea of successful and unsuccessful students. I'm going to go back to the big picture to see what teachers can do." And there, it argues, the shift is starting to emerge, where he starts to see that his very framing of the question is an instance of teachers blaming students. He starts to see that students' personalities and engagement are dynamic, and that the question, or questions around practice, have to be seen in a larger context. And I'll make the argument for this as we go forward. But that is a space where I'd argue that this concept of teachers blaming students is starting to emerge. The final point that I'll just discuss here is, I think close to the end of the year, and this was after Alan had formulated his questions, the next meeting at hand, I did a presentation, briefly talked about shared some work with George Lipsitz and thinking about the possessive investment of whiteness and really thinking about how whiteness is constructed. And after finished my presentation, Alan was the first person to respond. And Alan says, at this point, I feel a lot of times when we talk about schooling, what our role as teachers is, it's very hard for us to hold these big pictures in mind as well. What does it mean to be teaching in a system where it is not accidental that poverty exists? It's not accidental that there's a huge disparity in wealth. I think it's very easy for us to fall back on the family, or for example, or it's a lack of opportunities. But to what extent are those lack of opportunities built very much within the larger system? And it's important here to, again, think about the complex ways in which we're making sense of this. Because Alan had just visited one of his cousin's schools in a place that I call Newberry, which has the highest median income in California. It's kind of the nestled community. But he speaks about this in terms of it looking like the high school looking like a liberal arts college next to a country club. And a lot of what we're contending with in that space becomes very real for him in terms of seeing where his cousins go to school and in the context in which he teaches. And what's important here is Alan starts in the following interview, as well as conversations we had in our meetings, Alan starts to articulate this position. Well, students are really different at different points of the day. Thinking about looking back at our grading system in a 30-year hindsight. And he argues that it's not only unfair, but it's kept a whole group of people out of being college eligible. He was really fast engaging with this idea of how schools perpetuate the whole thing about the stratified labor force. But most importantly, thinking about himself. How am I do things to counteract that, and how I can tweak things, how I can do these things myself to change that. Now, part of what's happening here, he's seeing the big picture in relationship to his own practice, and he starts to modify his practice accordingly as well. So just to conclude this part, I think this process, it's only after this year-long process that he starts to see that his initial formulation of this question itself is an instance of teachers blaming students, at least from a different conceptual understanding. So what's the big takeaway from here? I'd argue it's important for us to acknowledge how difficult it was for Alan to formulate this idea. I mean, he had the language, he had the surface level language, right? He authentically believed it. And around issues of social justice in terms of thinking about forms of inequity, but for him to see that that's pertinent to what he does in the classroom and how he's formulated his lens was a long process. And so how teachers and teacher educators learn to see a concept such as teachers blaming students in their own practice, even when they have strong commitments to racial equity and justice, can be gradual, intermittent, and sometimes regressive. And how do we contend with these issues as teacher educators? I think it's also important for us to step back and think about what opportunities do we provide in teacher education for a deep, sustained, committed, as much in depth in this slides, but I do very briefly want to think about the programmatic structure and cultures that exist. And again, there's a tendency for us to think about these issues as very individualized, but how can we step back and think about programs? So I'd argue that two prevalent, very simplified models of thinking about change and programs in teacher education. One, I think, is heavily influenced by psychological models around beliefs and attitudes, but it's a sense that a teacher candidate comes in within the larger context of a society defined by whiteness, and the role of a teacher education program is to get them to rethink their ideas, right, or change their beliefs and attitudes. So somehow, as a teacher education program, we shift this person from dominant or understandings of race and racism to forms of racial justice that are more aligned to our programs. There's another model that thinks about socialization processes, right? And thinking about prospective teachers coming in, socialized by family and friends, schools and neighborhoods, their village organizations, society, media at large. And somehow, as teacher education programs, we're supposed to attend to re-socializing them and giving them a different experience, and they come out with But I think both of these models are really, it might be problematic in terms of thinking about teacher education programs as very isolated forms of practice, isolated institutions. But people are connected in much more complex ways. Teacher education programs are connected in much more complex ways, and different dimensions of society are connected in complex ways. So how do we engage these complexities? So part of what I was looking at in this study was really trying to contend with how programs are structured that support or discourage particular types of racialized identities. And so this study largely drew on in-depth interviews with 14 pre-service teachers, and I focused on 4 white pre-service teachers in this study. But thinking about ways in which we can both prioritize a critical analysis of whiteness and a learning perspective at the same time. So part of what I'm going to share here is thinking about an explanatory framework of programs of teacher education as mediators of racial identity. So what I want us to first think about is just take 2 minutes to hear the narrative of one of these teacher candidates.
I felt like I couldn't talk in that classroom because I felt there were a lot of people expressing their interest on their experience being a Latina or person of color, and I felt like my opinion wasn't valued because I was white, then supposedly privileged, and I don't know what it's like to go through something hard. So a lot of times I feel like I was frustrated because I felt like I was the white girl of privilege when I guess I felt judged before I got to know these people. It would have been nice to get to know some of them. That's why the cohorts work. We could talk about those issues because we each know each other's story, each other's background. So it's very different in a classroom where you don't know the majority of the people in there.
So, just to again dissect at least one or 2 sentences that Lisa was sharing here, and argue that 2 dominant ways in which we've thought about issues such as this is one, really grounded in theories of whiteness. And what we see here is undoubtedly Lisa's identifying with a larger ideology of white victimhood. It's very much pervasive within the larger political context. We see that in terms of allegations of reverse discrimination. We see that in arguments against affirmative action, or any arguments that support colorblindness and this assumed post-racial or post-civil rights society that Linnea Silver writes about. So there are these ideologies that she can identify with, right? And there's definitely a way in which this notion of white victimhood is playing out here. And from a perspective that really prioritizes theories of whiteness, what we see is that she's replicating whiteness here, right? She's really creating a context where it's hard to ask difficult questions because it's going to come back to fundamental ideas around white victimhood, really undermining a deep interrogation of race and racism. And that's important for us to acknowledge, right? That this doesn't happen in the abstract. It's not just Lisa's feelings, but Lisa's feelings are embedded within a larger social and political structure. The challenge, though, is I think that's an important critique for us to bring at a systemic level. But what do we do with that as teacher educators? If we don't see possibilities of change, we're in a very limited position there. On the flip side, we've seen work, people like Karen Lowenstein are arguing for a teacher's learner approach. We've made an argument that teacher education programs aren't supportive of white candidates in particular, which again makes it an important acknowledgement that there's a human side to people, right? There's an emotional side, and processes of change and learning happen within this human side of feeling either a part of an institution or outside of it. But again, the challenge here, though, is if we emphasize learning to that degree, we can erase these complexities around power. Right? So there's an inherent tension here in terms of engaging questions around structure and ideology, and engaging questions of learning. And we see this, right, in terms of Lisa's argument that I felt like I couldn't talk. There's a very subjective experience there, which is real. It becomes ideological in terms that it speaks to her, and she can articulate that with a larger notion of white victimhood. But what we also see is in that classroom, there was a lot of people expressing their interests, right? So there's something to be said about the interactions and norms that exist within that classroom space or within that programmatic space. And then it becomes quickly racialized as well, right? In terms of who has the space to speak, how they can speak, and again, in many ways, reversing the critiques that students of color who have traditionally been marginalized from these programs have brought about institutions of higher education. And so she's trying to use those same critiques to support her position. And these become complexly interrelated. I'm going to skip over this one just in terms of time. But here, I really think it's important for us to think about ways in which larger ideological processes intersect with program structure and culture. And just to specify here, in terms of program structure, really thinking about it as relatively stable arrangements of program, whether it's admission prerequisites, course offerings, reports, field placements, the faculty who teach it, that largely determine membership and then shape interactions. And, but the program culture are the norms, the values, the rituals, the ceremonies that make the persona of a program. And these build up over time, and they're used as people try to contend with challenges that exist. And as a whole, thinking about how both the structure and culture shapes notions of, say, mutual learning among peers, investment in the success of fellow teachers, or competition over markers such as a good teacher. And we saw this a lot in the program that I studied, where it had a strong focus on being a social justice educator. Right? And this notion of being a social justice educator then became a marker to compete over. Right? And there was a ways in which students would say you're not socially just enough, or what you're saying is not socially just. And it became a marker of competition as opposed to a lens that starts to uncover questions of power. And what I'd argue here is it's at this intersection of ideology, and there are a number of ways of being white, for instance, in this country. Right? You can be a white national, you can be a white person who believes that racism doesn't exist and we've transcended that. You can be an anti-racist white. There are multiple ways of being white that have ideological connections, right? Program structure includes and excludes some of those ways of racialized identity in terms of admissions, in terms of who we recruit. But then the culture also supports or discourages different ways of instantiating those racialized identities. And I'd argue that each program of teacher education, when we start to look at it, there are different available identities or racialized identities. There are ways in which you can be white or a person of color or a particular racialized group in many ways, right? But what is it about program structure and culture that creates those opportunities? And again, we saw this in terms of, going back to Lisa's example, the sense that I can't speak within that space, within that class is again both shaped by this larger ideology of white victimhood, but there's also real questions around how the program has structured those conversations. Right? Who gets to speak, how they get to speak, how do you listen to others in particular ways? And there's a dynamic that exists there. And I think a lot of times, particularly as teacher educators, we tend to focus on the ideological and not think about our own culpability in creating those spaces that either that create productive or problematic norms of interaction. And building on Sparta and Kusak's work and trying to extend that, particularly since I was working with interview data, thinking about how these racialized identities develop in terms of how people start to see themselves, how they see others, but how they also perceive that others see them. Right? And I'd argue within these spaces and within these interactions, there are particular instantiated racialized identities that emerge. And the responsibility to us as teacher educators to then think about our programs as creating, co-constructing, or mediating these identities, and what it means for us to step back and really look at the language that we use as individual instructors or program-wide, and how they're in concert, how they conflict to create these multiple forms of identity. So I'm going to skip over this slide. But again, argue that there are different ways, we also saw these identities of a white ally to the struggles of racial justice develop within this program in really extraordinary ways. And trying to understand what context supported those constructions as opposed to the constructions of these other students. And part of it was also programmatic. There was a sharp divide between the elementary and the secondary program, and places where these conversations could happen and couldn't happen. And part of it, I'd argue, is really problematic in that sense. I focused a lot on white teachers, but I do want to also acknowledge that these arguments play out, particularly for prospective teachers of color as well. And as Christine Snyder has argued, there has been an overwhelming presence of whiteness within teacher education programs, and we haven't attended to the unique strengths and needs of teachers of color. Two pieces that have been that have worked on is one thinking about this process of college student activists who become teachers, right? And they've really worked in a context where institutional opposition and coming in and having a clear sense of we're the people and that's the institution, and having organized in ways that are really successful by drawing those binaries, coming to teacher education programs and struggle. Because part of the challenge there is, how do you translate those experiences, those strong critiques of institutional forms of oppression, to pedagogy in your classroom? And it really requires recalibrating both philosophy and pedagogy, and starting to re-articulate them, and also coming from a place of students, these teachers were probably exposed and engaged more deeply with issues around race and racism in college, and there's a deep sense of, I was only exposed to this in college, I want to bring it back to my classroom early on in high school. But really thinking about, how do you do that in a way that honors the diversity of perspectives that exist in your classrooms and the multiple places where your students might be, right? And this process of growth is tremendously difficult. We've also been trying to look at how discourse is being critical, and part of what we try to problematize here is even the important work of people such as Jeff Andrade, where there's a categorization of people and teachers being a gangster, a gangster, or a writer, and it makes a static identity. But then there's competition over who's critical in some ways, right? And oftentimes what we see is then there's only one way of being critical, particularly for students of color, that erases other ways of being critical, right? And critical in terms of exposing processes of power and privilege. So these issues play out in very different ways, both similar and dissimilar ways for young people, young teachers of color. But it's important for us to, again, understand what is the program context in which this is occurring, right? In terms of how do we prioritize particular ways of being critical, but then it erases other opportunities, right? And again, some argue that these ways of being critical are also particularly masculine and particularly heteronormative, right? And how we also complexify those ways of being critical. So the big takeaway from this is the need to insert our agency and choices as teacher educators in the analysis of prospective teachers' ideological shifts by highlighting our role as individuals who co-construct the program structure and culture that partially instantiates these teachers' racialized identities. So with this, I do want to just close and bringing some of these questions back into the larger perspective that we started off with. But how do you move ahead if this is a larger context of economic inequality, racialized violence, racial control that we're working in? And for me, it really comes back to this question, of thinking about ourselves as teacher educators, but then also working with teachers and schools and programs with teacher educators as sites. Again, and we saw this in Alan's case, we saw this in Lisa's case, but these become sites where we learn, instruct, consent to, navigate, and test, and re-engage in society. So what's our responsibility here? Again, going back to this notion of our I would argue our collective conversation as teacher educators has very much been dominated by this argument around surviving. It's been dominated by this notion of staying relevant and pushing the conversation forward, or trying to do the best that we can. But how can we come back to this idea of recognizing and supporting teachers as conscious social agents in this fabric of society? And not to say that one force without the other. We need to be strategic in some ways and do this, but how do we make sure we don't lose this element of our work? I think it's also important for us to step back and think about the what, the why, and the how to of teaching for racial justice. But a big part of it is we know a lot about the why. We've seen that in a lot of social theory of why it's important to do this work. There's a lot of emerging work. Rich Milner's work, for example, thinking about the what. We need to think about meritocracy, we need to think about colorblindness. But one place where we haven't deeply engaged with is this question of how to. Right? How do we bring it, how do we understand these processes? And argue, to a certain degree, it comes back to our responsibility too, where we've placed a lot of the element on teaching for racial justice as if we have the solutions. Right? And how do we really think about this process of learning that occurs? And how do we really highlight those processes as well? And this work has to happen at multiple levels, right? It has to happen both with our respective teachers, but it has to happen within as well. And it has to happen with us as teacher educators. And for me, a big part of it is returning to a quote by Bell Hooks, who argues, for me, forgiveness and compassion are always linked. How do we hold people accountable for wrongdoing, and yet at the same time remain in touch with their humanity enough to believe in their capacity to be transformed? And I think this is a struggle before us, that we live in a complex world that's nuanced by power at multiple levels, and there are historical wrongs that we need to address. There are contemporary wrongs that we need to address, not only in terms of race, but in multiple forms of power. But within that, if we hold on to that element without thinking about this, we're in a difficult position as teacher educators. And for us as teacher educators, I do think we need to embrace this dimension of Bell Hooks' argument. But for us to do that, we really need to link arguments around structure and ideology to learning. Because part of this notion of thinking about holding people accountable for wrongdoing and thinking about the larger historical context in which we work can't be addressed without deep engagement with structure and ideology. But thinking about those transformative processes can't happen without a focus on learning. And there's a space that I think is really essential for us to link. And my talk here, again, is an invitation to recognize the fact that all our work can contribute particular angles to this, but we really need to work collectively on thinking about articulating our work towards racial justice across levels of policy, programs, and pedagogy, and how we might move forward in that process. Thank you.
Feel free to jump in and make a comment or raise a question. Cap?
Well, my first question is, how in the world do you manage to slip into the University of Washington and do such thoughtful ethnographic work without us even seeing you? But the other question is, I wonder if you could help us imagine in kind of concrete terms where you feel you're experiencing nodes of progress with this agenda in your own programs at UCLA, because I'm imagining you're in this conversation with your colleagues in Center X and elsewhere.
So a lot of my work has been focused in my own classes. Moving that to a programmatic level, And I'll get into that in just a minute. But it's, for me, a lot of this work has been done within the context of my social foundations course, and really transforming the ways in which we engage these issues. Historically, social foundations has been a very theory-heavy course, where we learn theories, and it's been a process of really thinking about how we begin to engage these notions of rethinking ourselves, rethinking our classrooms, our schools, and society, and creating identities that of teachers not seeing themselves as technical, carrying out technical dimensions of teaching, but really thinking about shaping and reshaping and reimagining society. And part of that has also been more deeply engaging scenarios within the social foundations course that starts to extend this notion of teaching as a lens, right? A lens that we start to view the world, and we start to view the classrooms differently. So that those have been shifts within social foundations course. Institutionally, it's been harder to address for multiple reasons. I'm hopeful at how it's going to start moving forward, but one has been that after 2008, with a lot of the budget cuts, it really transformed our program. We used to place students in particular district schools that we partnered with, and it created a context where there was a relationship between schools. We could place our own prospective teachers within those classrooms, and the cultures at those schools changed over time. Come 2008, a lot of teachers up to their 6th year were either pink slipped or moved to different schools, and we lost a lot of the critical mass we had in those schools, because those teachers, most of them were within their first years of teaching. The other dimension is that LA Unified stopped hiring, and again, going back to the larger political context in which this is happening, charter schools were hiring heavily, and in corporate charters and student. So it's reshaped our program, and it's only now that we're starting to come back to district schools. But that's also affected people who had worked in our program for an extended period of time, suddenly being their appointments were minimized, and so there's been a lot that's been happening that's made this work much more difficult to happen at the programmatic level. And again, I briefly had this conversation earlier, but I'm not exactly sure how it works here, but we also see challenging relationships between Senate faculty and teacher ed faculty, and thinking about where institutional priorities are, and how to engage that work in creating a concerted research agenda within the teacher education program.
Miranda?
So I'm really curious about the white victimhood. And I wonder if there's a story sort of after that, because in particular with the overwhelming whiteness article that came out was really powerful. How do you see, or do you have experience with sort of what happens next when you prioritize, talking about whiteness and helping students think through that in the thoughtful ways you had, the questioning as a learner, without sacrificing what you were talking about, the sort of structural and maybe teach of color, kind of things. What happened next?
So this particular teacher, she went through it. This was at the end of the program, so this is what she left with. So I think that's, especially for the image that we have for ourselves as a program, I think that's really challenging. Going back to social foundations, I think part of the way we've shifted it, and some interview data that I do have that supports this argument. I think what was valuable is even very consciously thinking about how we reshape conversation around whiteness. Right? That I do think a lot of, like for Lisa and the program, the year that she went through, there's oftentimes a conflation of white people and whiteness. And this is I think a very problematic conflation that doesn't allow us to see systems of power. And part of what we've been working hard on is re-articulating that, where we start to see these as systems of power and how we differentially participate in systems of power. And I think that opens up new spaces that is oftentimes challenging when in people's own minds they haven't worked out what the relationship is. And I think both for people who are white or for people who are not white, and really thinking through the language that we develop programmatically, but also particularly within the social foundation space, to be able to understand those differences and those nuances, and to think about how each of us can either work to reproduce whiteness or challenge whiteness, right? Whether it's as educators of color, as white educators, that we're in a position where we end up, again, reproducing or challenging that system of power. And I think that was a really critical shift in terms of, again, it's not just one, reiterating this over time, but it's really building up a number of activities and readings that start to see these as operations of power. Does that?
Yeah, but I sort of have a follow-up because you kind of hit on one of these other questions I had, which was, when students have you experienced the sort of pushback in that the questions you're asking are also, as a teacher, you're politicized, and so is there ever this pushback that you have the ideology that you are pushing on students? And I'll speak specifically to praxis.
Absolutely, but I think part of part of the way to start off is I draw from a very particular understanding of ideology, right? And again, ideology is one of those words that have multiple connotations. Terry Eagleton is, I think I like his description of ideology, that the most common way in which we think about ideology is thinking about it as bad breath. We assume that other people have it and we don't. So there's that sense of ideology. But I draw a lot on Stuart Hall's work, and part of Stuart Hall's work is that all of how we think about the world and we make sense of the world is ideological, right? That it's that we see the society as ideological contestation. Right? There's always ideological contestations happening, but then the question, so what we step back and ask is, what are the assumptions I'm holding, and what are the potential consequences of these? Right? So it's not shying away from the idea that we have ideologies and we all reason ideologically, but then trying to understand what the outcome of each of those assumptions are, and trying not to hide it or assume that we're coming from a place of this larger stance where we see the world but we're not impacted by it. But this is a contestation over time.
Okay, in the back.
This question is also maybe a follow-up to Lorena's, but I'm wondering if you could speak to the role of community building in the teacher education program, and perhaps I'm reading into what you're saying too much, but it seems like that might potentially be something that could facilitate some of the bridge between the sort of teacher as learner approach and the approach that focuses so extremely on, or so intensely and exclusively on issues of whiteness and power, and how that happens maybe in the social foundations class, or how you use that in strategic ways to allow for conversations about whiteness versus white people, or both.
So the notion of community building is really can read it through a lot of different lenses, right? But sometimes community building can be very depoliticized.
Yeah.
And it's a sense of creating community where we support each other, so we don't ask each other difficult questions. And with work such as Haviland or BP Cower also shows ways in which, and one of Pauline Whitman's early works, I think it was a 98 piece, where she studies the teacher research group, right, where they build really strong community. But part of building that community is that they don't ask hard questions about issues of power. And so, so I think the type, so it goes back to these questions of what sort of community we build and how we interrogate these questions of power. And I think part of what we saw here, and I think that to a certain degree it still continues in the program, that the elementary ed program I think has a strong sense of community, like they're invested in each other, but part of being invested in each other is saying that we're going to support each other and we're going to make sure that you've got a shoulder to cry on, or we can go out for a drink afterwards, or we can help each other with looking over resumes. But it's not about asking difficult questions. And again, I think I go back to the need for us to do this more programmatically. In social foundations, we scaffold it over time. We start to, again, give opportunities for people to think about questions of power within that space, and trying to build a sense of solidarity, right? That so we move away perhaps from the language of community building to solidarity, and I think these are very there's a historical context for that, but really thinking about the notion of investing each other in building, really having to be tied into larger political change, and I think solidarity captures that in ways that community building can.
Thank you.
I wanted to just hear a bit about your advice on how to center race, specifically because I feel like a lot of times conversations around equity, while they try to be working with an intersectional framework and meeting people where they're at, often as soon as you broaden the discussion, race is the last thing that gets talked about, if at all. So I just wonder, based on experience, how you continue to center race while meeting people where they're at and letting them start at other experiences or questions, for example.
And specifically within teacher education
ed,
programs.
yeah.
So I think for us, it partially goes back to this question of the frames that we use, right? I'm surprised even in oftentimes having a conversation around race, right? And if we start off the conversation, what do we mean by race? And the ways in which we even, the tools that we have to conceptualize race are really limited. And, oftentimes people say, well, race is a social construction, but even understanding, going back to this, if it was so hard for Alan to understand the sense of, or not understand, to see teachers blaming students within the context of his work, when we say something like race is a social construction, we say that, but how do we see that in our day-to-day lives, right? And it's an enormously tall order that we're expecting people to jump into. And really thinking about this process of time. So we delve into the sense of social construction, right? In terms of thinking about what's the historical context, what's the economic, political context in which meanings take shape. But then what we also try to do is bridge, or at least in my classes, try to bridge different perspectives. So the work of Ray McDermott and thinking about cultural disability, right? I think that's another space where you can begin to see linkages, where you're not necessarily thinking about race particularly, but you're also thinking about ways in which this operates within a larger cultural context. And I think it's those moments of realization where we start to see race not as a construct with inherent meaning, but really thinking about it as a construction, right? asking ourselves, how is it being constructed here? So even looking at like media clips and thinking about this way in which, how is race being constructed here? And the emphasis on construction, I think, has been really powerful. That we're not asking a question like, how is this group affected by it and how this group is affected by it, but we're asking people to engage in that analytical process of saying, how is it being constructed in the range of activities that we participate in. It's like trying to look at the process and not the product has been really powerful.
Okay, one more question. Yeah.
Hi, I had a question about, so when teachers think more critically about race and racism, what is for you like the end goal for that being seen in the classroom, or changing those ideas of structural violence and emotional violence? Like what would you say is like the important end goal for in terms of the students?
So I think one thing I've come to appreciate again is how dramatically this changes both over historical time, but in particular context too. Like that, whether you're teaching in a school that's like the demographics of the school, but then also the political context in which that school is situated. I think for me, it's the end goal goes back to this notion of process, right? That teachers are deeply interrogating questions of power in their classrooms, right? So when they step into a school and they see that there's a discipline policy, but they are able to interrogate who does that benefit, who does that marginalize, right? How might we see a discipline policy in a historical context, right? How is it related to the school-to-prison pipeline? If we think about our classroom pedagogy, right, in terms of at one level asking who's participating, who's not participating, but then going back to the deeper question of like, who does the curriculum include and not include, and in some level even stepping back further and saying success for what? Maybe even if I have a class of students who are doing extremely well by all the standardized measures, what are we preparing students for? Right? What does it mean? I don't know what elementary schools look like here, but elementary schools in LA Unified almost exclusively teach mathematics and ELA, right? And what does it mean to prepare a generation of students who haven't engaged with social science, social studies, right? Who haven't engaged with the historical context, right? Those are questions they need to be asking. So I think in the end goal in that sense is more of a sense of teachers as social and political agents who really question and engage with and try to work on contextually appropriate solutions in solidarity with other groups. And that's, again, a tall order, but I think that's if I had encapsulated in one important idea.
One quick question. One quick question.
It's actually more of a comment. I appreciate the last comment you made about solidarity and having teachers learn how to build that. Because one thought that I'm thinking through all of this is through one of your examples about the time it takes for some of this change to occur. And teacher education programs are so short right now. So having to work with teachers about issues of race and racism and social justice, and we only have them for a certain amount of time. So trying to be both as direct and integrated as we can within that time. And then I'm thinking, what kinds of foundations or questions or habits do we want our teachers to be forming so that that learning continues when they've gone? And so young man who had all these ideas coming out of his program can learn how to continue questioning. And so I think that solidarity might be one, I'm thinking, just thinking, that I appreciate that, because then if they build that solidarity, they can continue to push each other and to continue learning.
Absolutely, and I think it maybe speaks back to this idea of at least with our program, how, and looking at websites of other programs, how notions of social justice might influence our meeting, right? And how we might need to articulate those a bit more clearly around constructs such as solidarity, and what that would mean, right? Or if we start to articulate more clearly what elements of social justice we're embracing here, right? And or we're trying to engage with. And I can see that as being a really productive space for us to have shared language around, or shared norms around too. Going back to Lisa's example, is what does it mean to learn in solidarity with someone else, even if they're, say, a racially privileged counterpart, right? That if we're working for solidarity, the ways in which we interact might look different. And how do we create that as a cultural norm within programs? And just a real need for us to start to articulate that across the levels of work. And I don't think the Academy really rewards or supports that sort of ways in which we can perhaps put aside the reward system within the Academy and try to understand ways in which we might forge closer alliances to do this work at a concerted level across these levels.
All right, well, let's thank